Growing up in a quiet suburb of Austin, Texas, David Whitman always stood out, not because he spoke the loudest or dressed the flashiest, but because he didn't. Even as a child, his calm, observant nature drew people in. He was the kid who sat in the back of the classroom, absorbed every word the teacher said, and rarely raised his hand unless absolutely necessary. But when he did speak, people listened. There was something about his presence, collected, careful, and calculated. He wasn't just smart. He was wise beyond his years. By the time he reached adulthood, David had built an impressive career as a cybersecurity analyst for a government agency. With top-level clearance and access to highly sensitive information, he learned the value of discretion, not just professionally but personally. His understanding of human nature, honed over decades of experience, convinced him that intelligence wasn't just about knowing things, it was about knowing what not to reveal. That belief guided every part of his life. It was a belief he lived by, especially when it came to three key areas he never discussed openly: his goals, his income, and his personal life. David understood that some things, when shared, could dilute their power, invite unwanted attention, or even sabotage his peace. These weren't just principles. They were survival mechanisms. His closest friend, Brian Turner, a talkative and affable software developer, often questioned David's mysterious tendencies. One evening, they were having dinner at a small Italian place downtown, catching up after months apart. Brian swirled his wine and leaned in, curious as ever. "David, man, you've always been low-key. But don't you ever get tired of being so reserved? I mean, you've got a nice car, you travel, you're in shape, but no one ever knows what you're really up to." David offered a slight smile. "I just prefer it that way." Brian chuckled. "Come on. Just once, spill the beans. What's one big goal you're working on?" David shook his head gently. "I can't do that, Brian. Not because I don't trust you, but because some things lose their magic when spoken out loud." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" David leaned back in his chair, watching the candlelight flicker on the table between them. "Like dreams. When you tell the wrong person, their doubt becomes a shadow over your ambition." That night, after parting ways, Brian thought about what David had said. He admired his friend's confidence but wondered if maybe David took it too far. Wasn't it lonely to live like that? What Brian didn't know was that David had learned these lessons the hard way. Years ago, David had confided in a former colleague named Marcus, someone he considered a mentor. They had worked side by side on a major project involving artificial intelligence systems for national defense. One late night over drinks, David shared an idea, a dream of starting his own AI consultancy firm that would use ethical coding standards to revolutionize the tech industry. Marcus listened, nodded, and even encouraged him. But months later, David discovered Marcus had pitched a similar idea to investors they both knew, starting a competing company under a different name. The betrayal left David disillusioned. That experience burned into David the first lesson: never share your goals prematurely. Not because others always have bad intentions, but because ambition is fragile when exposed too soon. Others can hijack, criticize, or undermine it, even unintentionally. David recovered, of course. He launched his own firm later, with stronger boundaries and smarter strategies, but from then on he worked silently. Even those closest to him never knew what he was building until it was fully formed. The second area David always guarded was his income. While his lifestyle showed comfort, he never bragged about his earnings, investments, or assets. Not even with Brian. This wasn't about modesty, it was strategy. David once dated a woman named Alyssa, a marketing executive who was charming, ambitious, and curious about everything. Their relationship was passionate at first, full of late-night conversations and shared dreams. But as time went on, David noticed her questions subtly shifting. "How much do you think a guy in your position makes? Would you ever consider buying a house in Beverly Hills? Do you have a trust fund or something?" At first, he brushed it off as curiosity, But over time, her interest in his financial standing started to outweigh her interest in him as a person. He noticed how she treated waiters differently when they dined at expensive places compared to more modest spots. He saw how she lit up when he mentioned business-class flights, yet seemed distant when he suggested a weekend cabin getaway. Eventually, he realized the relationship was more about perception than connection. That breakup solidified his second rule. Never talk about your income. Money changes how people treat you. It invites judgment, envy, and sometimes opportunism. People who truly care won't need to know your bank balance. The third area David kept private, his personal life, was the hardest to explain, especially to people like Brian, who believed in open hearts and full transparency. But David had seen enough in his life to know that privacy wasn't the opposite of honesty. It was a form of self-protection. His parents had a turbulent marriage. His father, a brilliant physicist, and his mother, a schoolteacher, clashed constantly over ideals, expectations, and especially appearances. His mother often shared their arguments with friends, neighbors, even her students, airing every personal detail. David grew up watching how exposing private matters didn't solve them, it only complicated them. It turned real problems into public drama. As an adult, David chose the opposite path. He never posted about relationships on social media. He didn't share family conflicts or emotional wounds with casual acquaintances. To him, vulnerability was sacred, not something to be broadcast. His restraint wasn't about secrecy, it was about control. In a world where oversharing had become the norm, David valued the quiet dignity of privacy. But one evening, everything he stood for was put to the test. It was a Thursday when David received a call from the FBI. His firm's server had been breached, and they suspected it was an inside job. Sensitive files were leaked, and because of the nature of their clients, this was a national security concern. David cooperated fully, but he was shaken. He called in his team, ran a full audit, and after days of combing through logs and access points, he discovered the breach had come through a device used by Brian. It turned out Brian had clicked a phishing link at a coffee shop while logged into David's company server remotely. The malware had tracked his credentials and quietly funneled data for weeks. David was furious, not at Brian, who was mortified and apologetic, but at the violation of trust and the breach of his guarded world. Everything he'd built, everything he'd protected, had been compromised through someone else's carelessness. After the dust settled, David met Brian one last time. They sat on a park bench overlooking Lady Bird Lake. Brian looked defeated. "I'm sorry, man. I messed up everything. I didn't mean to." David nodded. "I know. And I forgive you. But this changes things." Brian looked up. "You're cutting me off, aren't you?" David hesitated. "Not because I don't care, but because I need to rebuild what I lost, and I need to do it alone." That was the moment Bria